Hello everyone and welcome to the YouTube channel of BeingACCA. This is Tushita Gupta, ACCA affiliate, and we are continuing with our revision of the PM syllabus. So this video is going to be about chapter number 6, which is planning with limiting factors. Let's get started. This is chapter 6, planning with limiting factors. So basically, if you have, covered the syllabus before, you would know that this chapter basically talks about how you have to optimize the production when certain resources are with you in a limited quantity. As in, if you have a lack of certain resources and you have to optimize your production, you want to maximize the profits, the contributions that you earn. So this is the scenario where you get to learn how you are supposed to work in such sort of a situation. So the first thing that we learn is planning with one limiting factor. So there can be multiple limiting factors. There can be one limiting factor there, as in that means that there will only be one resource which you have in a short quantity than you actually need, or there can be multiple resources which are of a limited quantity available, and you have to optimize your profits according to that. So this is how we have this is how possible situations can be. So the first thing that we learn is planning with one limiting factor. So planning with one limiting factor, basically you can also call it as key factor analysis. So the one limiting factor which you have, one thing which you have in a lesser quantity than you need, is something which becomes your key factor. So you are analyzing according to optimize the key factor so that you are able to maximize your profits. So first of all, let's see what process we have to follow if we have such a situation with us. So the process will go something like this. The first step in the process, what will you do? You will first identify which is your limiting factor, which is your scarce resource, which is something you have in a lesser quantity than you actually need it for. So the first step will be to identify the scarce resource. Now, once you have identified your scarce resource, the second step that you're going to have to do is find out how much contribution you are earning per unit for each product. So let's suppose we are selling two sorts of products. We are selling sweets, we are selling biscuits. So for each of the different products, how much is the contribution we are earning per unit of that product? So second thing we are going to do is to calculate the contribution per unit per product. Right? Once we do this, the next thing is to find out, how much is the contribution that we are earning per unit of the scarce resource that we are using, because scarce resource is something which we have in a limited quantity, which we have to optimize. So this is something which we are, going to find out that how much are we earning contribution because of using the per unit of the scarce resource. So the third step will be to find out to calculate the contribution per unit of the scarce resource. So perhaps let's try to understand this with the help of an example. So perhaps I'm selling two sorts of products. Let's suppose I'm selling tea and I'm selling coffee. So the contribution that I'm perhaps earning in terms of dollars is, let's suppose, 5 and 10 on tea and coffee. And when it comes to the time, so perhaps the one limiting factor which I have is the coffee machine time, the coffee or tea machine. Let's suppose there's only one machine, so the machine time. So let's suppose that it's taking me perhaps 1 minute for tea and 2 minutes for a coffee. So basically, I have identified my scarce resource, which is machine time. Then the second step is to find out the contribution per unit per product, which is already given. For tea, it is 5 and coffee, it is 10. And the third step is to calculate the contribution per unit of the scarce resource. So contribution per unit of the scarce resource will be 5 by 1 for tea, and for coffee, it will be 10 by 2, which is 5. So I can see that for each unit of the machine time, in 1 minute I'm only earning 5 in terms of tea, and I'm earning 10, the contribution that I'm earning per machine time, like per unit of the machine time, which is my scarce resource, is also 5. So over here it won't really matter. Probably let me try to change the time it is taking. Perhaps let's take over here. Let's suppose coffee is taking 5 minutes of the machine time. So in 1 minute of using my scarce resource, I'm earning $5 worth of contribution. But when it comes to coffee, let's suppose 10 by 5 will be my contribution per unit of the scarce resource. So 10 is the contribution that I'm earning on coffee. But this 10, for this $10 of contribution, I have to spend 5 minutes of my scarce resource, which is machine time. So 10 by 5 will give me 2. That means for every minute that I'm spending making tea, I'm earning a contribution of $5, and for coffee, I'm earning a contribution of 2 for 1 minute. So basically, this means selling tea is more profitable for me, because for every 1 minute of the scarce resource, I'm able to generate more contribution. So the next step will then be to rank the products. So perhaps if there had been more products, let's suppose there were some other beverages also, and for that beverage, probably this would have been 3. So basically, my ranking would be first of all tea, then I will go for the beverage, and then for the coffee. So this is how I will rank the products according to how much contribution they are earning. Obviously, the one which is giving me more contribution will come first. Then the last step will be to allocate the resources according to the ranking. Allocate resources according to the ranking. So what do we mean by this is that perhaps let's suppose in the cafe where I'm selling all of these things, tea, beverages, and coffee, let's suppose I have, in an ideal situation, I would only want to sell tea because tea is something which is giving me the highest contribution. But in a real life scenario, there might be a possibility that the maximum demand for tea may be a fixed number. So probably I'm only able to sell, let's suppose, 1500 units of tea in a day. So then the next thing that I will do is go for the beverage, and then I will go for coffee according to the maximum demand that I can cater in the order of the preference in which I have ranked the product according to the contribution per unit of the scarce resource which I am generating from it. So this is how you will work in a scenario where you have where you have to do planning with one limiting factor. So let's also discuss the assumptions that it takes. Assumptions form a very important part, because whenever you may even be straight away asked the assumptions, but even if you're not, limitations do get asked often. And when it comes to writing limitations, the assumptions become the limitations of the model. So the assumption number 1 under key factor analysis is that it assumes that there is a single quantifiable objective. There is a single quantifiable objective. Now, what do we mean by this? This means that, when it comes to what I want to achieve with this entire analysis, I want to achieve to maximize my profit. And there's only one objective that I have, which is quantifiable, that this is the profit that I'm going to earn, and profit will always be in terms of numbers. So hence it is quantifiable. It is not something qualitative. It is something which can be put into numbers. So that is why this means that the first assumption is that there is a single quantifiable objective. Now, the second assumption which this model has is that each product uses the same quantity of the scarce resource per unit. So, each product uses the same quantity of the scarce resource per unit. Then the next assumption that this model has is that your contribution per unit remains constant, like other models we have studied the assumptions for. So it also assumes that the contribution per unit remains constant. So basically this means that your selling price and your variable costs remain constant, because only if they remain constant then your contribution per unit will remain constant. And even if there's like a decrease in the selling price, there has to be a decrease in the material, or if there's an increase in the selling price, there has to be an increase in the material. That means, in a sense, contribution per unit has to remain constant. So this is assumption number 3 over here. Another assumption which we have is products are independent. Products are independent. Now by this we mean that, making one product does not affect whether or not the other product gets made. So perhaps if we talk about dependent products, it could be, for example, milk, and you make butter out of that milk. So these are dependent products, because if you do not have the milk, then butter would also not be possible. So this assumption, the model that we are talking about, the key factor analysis, only works in scenarios where your products are independent of each other. And then the last assumption that we have is that the scenario is short term. Scenario is short term. That means we are only looking at the short term. We are not having a long term focus with this. This model is only so that you can find out for yourself an optimal production plan in the short run. This is not very good when it comes to planning for longer term solutions. So this is it about the key factor analysis. Then the next topic that we have in this chapter is linear programming. In the recent attempts, this topic has begun to be examined a lot. There have been graphs which have been provided in section B questions, and you have to answer questions based on that. So please ensure that you're preparing this topic well. So basically there are steps, again, like we had steps, the process for this method. Similar is a process in linear programming. So over here you will have multiple constraints. Over here in this key factor analysis, you had only one limiting factor, but now you will have multiple things which will be in a limited quantity available to you. So the first step over here would be to define the variables. So basically this will be like, if suppose I am deciding how much of what I'm going to produce, so probably product 1, how much I produce product 1, let that be X, product 2, let that be Y, and so on. So this is how you will define the variables. Then the second step will be to define and formulate the objectives. Define and formulate the objectives. So objectives over here will basically just like, the previous time would be to maximize the profit. It can vary from situation to situation, but usually it is to maximize the profit. So, we will have our objective as max P is equals to, let's suppose, 10x plus 5y, where 10 and 5 are the profits or contributions that we are earning per unit of x and y. So then the third step, once you have defined and formulated your objective, would be to formulate the constraints. Now over here, as we discussed, there will be multiple things which will be restricting you, which will be constraining you, which will be your constraints. So you have to formulate the constraints. So let's suppose a resource which I have, perhaps labor. So maybe for labor in total, I only have 1800 hours. Product X takes 5 hours. Product Y takes, let's suppose, 6 hours. So the maximum that I have is 1800 hours. I cannot exceed that. So this becomes my first constraint. Again, perhaps let's suppose one material which both of these use. So let's suppose 3x plus 2y, and the total material that we have available with us is, let's suppose, 5000 kgs of material which is available. So there can be multiple constraints. This is just, I am giving an example so that it becomes more clear to you. Then the fourth thing over here, the fourth step will be to draw a graph. And once you draw the graph, you will also be able to identify a feasible region. So perhaps this is where one line cuts, this is where the other cuts, this is where, let's suppose, the third one cuts. So the feasible region will be the area which will be common to all of the lines. So this region will be common to all of the lines. So basically this will become your feasible region, and this is how we work out a solution will be found out somewhere over here in the feasible region. Then the fifth step will be to solve for the optimal production plan. Solve for optimal plan. So using the equations that you have arrived at and having a feasible region, you will be able to get the solution where your profit becomes maximized, while at the same time you are considering all the constraints which you are facing, all of the things which you have in a limited quantity. So this is the steps basically. If we talk about linear programming, then there are two methods. So when it comes to the methods, the first method that you have is the inspection method, which is more like a hit and trial method. And then the second method is the ISO contribution line. ISO contribution line. So these are the two basic methods which usually are used to solve the graphs. And when it comes to solving the graphs, the first thing will be to find out the products. Usually in the scenarios which come up in the exam, there will mostly be two products. Then the second step will be to find your limiting factor, like we discussed above, just to reiterate how you solve this. So find your limiting factor, then you find your objective function. So usually the objective will be to maximize profits, or perhaps minimize your costs or your variable costs. So this is how you will get to the objectives, and once you are able to figure out all of the three things, you will also be able to arrive at the solution. Now since we have discussed assumptions for the previous models also, let's also discuss what are the assumptions over here in linear programming. Again, one common assumption which remains is that, again, this is a short-term short-term focus. So basically, why is that? Because it ignores the fixed costs. Ignores fixed costs. Hence, this is a linear programming model has a short-term focus. Then another thing is that your objective, again, like we talked about earlier, objective is a single quantifiable objective. Quantifiable, just like above. And again, just like above, your products are independent. Then it also assumes that your contribution, just like above, contribution and VC per unit, variable costs and contribution per unit are again constant. And another assumption, again, which is same to the previous one, is that your product consumes same amount of resources. Same amount of resources. So these are the assumptions, more or less similar to what were there in the key factor analysis. Now we are done with the assumptions of linear programming. Now just let's discuss a few more concepts which are associated with linear programming. So the first thing that we would like to talk about is slack. So slack is anything wherein your resource is not used. It is perhaps, let's suppose you have 100 kgs of, let's suppose, raw material A, but you are only using let's suppose 50 kgs of material A. So in this case, the amount by which the resource is underutilized, that will be called the slack. So if 100 is available and I'm only using 50, then 50 kgs of raw material becomes my slack. And this is also applicable to unfulfilled demand. So perhaps I have a demand of 1,000 cupcakes and I'm only able, because of my limitations, perhaps I'm not having resources to make more, I'm only able to fulfill the demand of 800 cupcakes. So that means 200 is the extent by which the demand remains unfulfilled. So that will be called slack. Now, whenever there is a slack, identifying where the slack is will always help you to find out where the resources are underutilized and how you can utilize to the best possible capacity. So this is all that we talk about slack. Then there's another concept associated with linear programming, which is the shadow price. Shadow price can also be called dual price. In the exam, the examiner may use the other terms, so you should be aware of all the possible terms that there are. So basically, the shadow price is the increase in the contribution that you will get if there is one additional unit of the limiting factor. So basically, perhaps let's suppose labor is my limiting factor, and I have 1,000 units of labor available with me, with which I'm able to produce a certain amount of a certain amount of products which I'm able to sell off in the market. Now, by how much will my contribution increase if I have one more unit of my limiting factor, which is my labor? So perhaps if I have 1,001 units of labor, so maybe at 1,000 units of labor, my contribution was, let's suppose, $5,000, and maybe at 1,001, I might be able to earn a contribution of, let's suppose, 5,003. So basically, the additional increase that I have in my contribution, which is by $3, this is the increase in the contribution that I'm getting due to having one additional extra unit of the resource, which is in a limited quantity, which is my limiting factor. So basically, to have an additional premium, to have an additional contribution of $3, how much is the maximum that I can pay that labor? So maybe that labor, this example, this is a very small amount. So perhaps, you're probably paying your labor $1, just taking a hypothetical situation. So in that situation, to have this extra contribution, you may be even willing to pay that labor $2, because you'll be getting $3 extra. So if you pay two, you'll still have $1 extra. So $3 basically over here will be the maximum that you will be able to pay, because if you pay more than that, you will have no benefit. Even at $3, you are at a no profit no loss situation, but over and above 3 you will not go. So basically, shadow price will be the maximum price that a firm will be willing to pay, the maximum over and above the usual rate, to get the additional unit of the limiting factor. So this is what shadow price or dual price means. Now there is another thing which we can talk about, and this is about critical constraints and non-critical constraints. Non-critical constraints. So basically, like the name suggests, these are critical constraints will be those constraints. Critical means important, anything which is important at my optimal profit, where I'm maximizing the profit, whichever resource is important there, that will be a critical constraint. So basically, at critical constraints will be those constraints which will have lines where optimum answer exists. Optimum answer exists. And vice versa, this will have lines where optimum answer does not exist, because these are not important. Even if we are not using them in the maximum capacity, we are still able to maximize the profit or the contribution, whichever our objective is. So over here, like I said, over at critical constraints, the utilization will be 100%, because that is why they are critical, because using them is something which is enabling us to maximize the profit. So for the critical constraints, the utilization will be 100%. When it comes to this, it's going to be the exact opposite. This will not be 100%, right? Then another thing which we can discuss about this is, when it comes to critical constraints, there will be no slack. Slack does not exist. Why? Because like we said, slack is any amount in which the resource is unutilized. So here the utilize is 100%, that is why there is no slack. Over here the utilization is not 100%, so the difference between the full capacity and the quantity which we are actually using will be the slack. So the slack exists over here. And then the last point which we talk about, so whenever there is we are using something for 100%, and probably having one more additional unit will be able to give us some extra contribution. So over here you will have a shadow price. Shadow price exists, but for those resources which we are anyway not using in the full capacity, and we anyway have them extra, so will we be paying anything extra to get more of them? No, right? Because we are not getting any extra contribution by having one more unit of the non-critical constraints, because we already have them in a quantity which we do not even fully need. So over here there will be no shadow price. Shadow price does not exist. So with this, we have finished the revision of this particular chapter, chapter number 6, planning with limiting factors. In the next video, we will be revising chapter number 7. I hope that these videos are turning out to be useful in your preparation towards the ACCA PM exam. Should you have any queries, please feel free to drop comments down below. You can always message us on Instagram at BeingACCA. Thank you so much. All the best for your exam. Bye-bye.